Hello, hello. Welcome to Autonomy's Do It Live podcast, where today I am going to teach you about the practice and an application of remote viewing and how that can actually be related to business. And you can actually run a business either doing it yourself or using it for your own business applications. So a lot of people do not know what remote viewing is whatsoever. And as a result of that, there's a huge amount of misinformation about it. And so instead of getting me to explain it to you, I'm going to get one of the foremost remote viewers in the world, Joe McMonagle, to do it for you. Did I just close the window for that? No, I did not. Okay. I just got to reshare my screen, and I'm going to let him do that and give you a very, very basic overview of what. Let me get out of this full screen. Why is it not doing that? Yes, we already did that. Okay, got it. Okay, anyways, Joe McMonagle. He's going to explain the very basics of what remote viewing is. And we will continue from there. Come on.
Here, Jeff. Maybe before we get into the future of remote viewing, we could define for our viewers who may not know what remote viewing actually is.
Remote viewing is the ability under protocol, the ability to describe a person, place, event, anything that's remote from you that you have absolutely no access to and no one's told you anything about.
The protocol aside, it's very similar to what parapsychologists and others have called clairvoyance for the last 100 years.
Yes, it probably is closer to clairvoyance because we don't know how the information gets to the psychic. We do know that it can be noise, taste, smells, visions. It could be anything all mixed together. You can have kinesthesia taking place, so, almost anything.
It's a controversial field because on the one hand, you participated in a government-sponsored program that ran for 20 years. And on the other hand, there are many, many people out there in the world today who, A, either have no knowledge, or B, have a great deal of misinformation about it, or C, believe that it's impossible and could never have occurred in the first place.
That's correct. All three groups. I'm not sure which one's the largest.
Mm-hmm. But if we look toward the future of remote viewing, in the most positive sense, with your vast wealth of experience in the field, I should imagine you might have some recommendations for young people coming into the field of remote viewing today as to how they might have the best success with it.
I think the number one thing I would say right off the bat, there's just a raft of information out there that's been done by valid, reputable scientists. Please read the data that they've produced because it tells you a lot about what it can't do and a lot about what it can do.
One of the things that you mentioned to me earlier is that early on in the work, you had some interaction with the CIA, and their main concern is how can they protect U.S. government secrets from being remote viewed by foreign agents?
That's exactly correct. That came very early in the program. Our initial operations, I would say within the first 6 months, were successful enough that they became concerned about how do you block this thing called remote viewing? How do you shield against it? And quite literally, there is nothing that we found so far that says you can shield against it. One of the issues, in fact, is that it fails enough on its own, Jeff. So you can't, you almost can't rely on it anyway, unless you have some very stable subjects that are, capable of producing very repeatable reputational quality stuff.
Now, you are a person who probably ranks amongst the very best remote viewers, working with the best teams available for the last nearly 4 decades. You've been surrounded by good researchers.
Exactly right.
And you've worked under conditions of double-blind protocols, the best all the way. I know you've done a large number of remote viewings that have been nearly 100% accurate in great detail, and partially because you're a very good artist. You can draw exceedingly well. And still, even under the best of circumstances, the controversy surrounds your work.
Exactly. And I think the reason why is the skeptics is not a good word. The spoilers, the ones who deliberate about the way they attack any science, almost in the paranormal. The way they see it is they're shown examples, and they're usually singular in nature. And almost any example you give them, there's ways of picking it apart to make it deliberately look like it's ridiculous and that it's possible that it was faked and all these kinds of things when they weren't there and they have no idea what the protocols required.
But they operate from a worldview that simply says it can't be real, therefore it must be fake. And however implausible their scenario is for how it was fake, they prefer to believe that.
They'll actually display that. You know, some of them are magicians by trade, and they will actually demonstrate something that looks close to what you've just done, only they're cheating. And that's never pointed out, you know.
But they say, I did it, I can cheat and fool you, therefore that's what they must be doing.
And my answer to that is, well, you just filmed it, so show me where it's been cheated.
Alrighty, and so that's his basic intro, and I wanted to leave the stuff in there about the scoffers, as they're often referred to, because there's one in particular that I can already hear the criticisms coming from people, you know, that, well, James Randi had this challenge and no one beat James Randi's challenge, therefore anything to do with any of this is already debunked. You know, obviously none of the stuff he said is true, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are numerous issues that can be brought up about James Randi and his challenge, because it is still to this day largely one of the most widely thrown criticisms of any of this information, whether it's remote viewing, whether it's anything with the near-death experience research, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, psychokinesis, so on. I do want to throw this over to Lloyd Auerbach and sort of some of his experience with the contractual issues with Randi and his prize back in the day.
And I think one of the best cases that Randi had, because he had his $1 million challenge to any psychic or paranormal person who thought they could prove under controlled circumstances. Natasha Demkina, have you heard of this young Russian girl? I think she did phenomenally, and they actually statistically scored her accuracy. So she came from Russia with her mother to take the Randi challenge, and she was a medical intuitive. She was, I think, 12 at the time, maybe 14. And she was doing, she was able to see into people's past injuries, health ailments, and scan their bodies psychically. And Randi had it set up that, and one of the agreements that she had, because you can make up your rules with Randi, she wanted her mother with her. And last minute, they changed the time. She was still jet lagged, so they had her perform when she was jet lagged. They took her mother away. She was crying. She was visibly upset. So they're testing the psychic child under these terrible conditions. They've changed the agreement halfway through, and even still, I think she got something like 4 out of 10 or something correct, which statistically was very valid, even though it doesn't seem on a carnival style. That's the other thing.
Right.
You know, and so maybe you want to speak to any of that, like his methodologies.
Yeah, you know, I dealt with Randi's challenge in several articles in Fate and other places, and as well as other types of media. When you read the challenge, you know, there was the agreement you have, that the application you fill out, what you're agreeing to, and there's the actual rules of the challenge. In many respects, it was the application and agreement to what you are agreeing to in order to do this that created more. I said, I advise people not to go for the challenge mainly because of that. Forget about the rules of the challenge. I mean, people in my field were concerned that there really wasn't $1 million. Yes, that was verified finally. That money was in escrow. I know Stanley Krippner, one of my colleagues, was involved in some of the testing. Julian Isaacs was involved in some of the testing. Another one of my colleagues, Julian may have, I think, was involved in that one case you mentioned with Natalia, because he was severely critical of Randy and his people not allowing this person to rest. And that was a common thing, to push someone. We'll tweak it until we're all satisfied the controls are right. Oh, and by the way, now that it's been, you had to do it 30 times till we get everything right, you don't have any time to rest. You have to do it again right now, and you have to do it under those conditions. So that in itself as an end result is not right. The challenge rules themselves included little bits like the fact that if you won, first of all, you're signing away any right to sue no matter what Randy says. So essentially, yes, you'll get $1 million. But Randy and his people could say you cheated. They could pretty much libel, defame you as much as they wanted to make you out as a con artist, and you couldn't say anything about that. Second thing is they owned the results. Third thing was, if you failed, you would never make those claims again. You would agree you'd never make those claims again.
And if you
so
did,
basically,
they could sue
it's like, that's right. So essentially, you are screwed if you win. You have $1 million. You're screwed otherwise if you win. Your reputation is going to be smeared anyway. Although I contended to one psychic that I said, the fact is, though, that if he claims you conned him, you can make a big deal about that and shut him up, because clearly if somebody could con him, his challenge is not worth anything, nor is he. They could have really shut him up, but they wouldn't have been able to claim they were a psychic because Randy owned the rights to all of that. So I actually showed, my dad was a sports producer for NBC and on his own afterwards, and I showed the application to a number of folks in the sports world, including and also a couple of entertainment lawyers. And I wanted to say, I said, look, would you do this as an athlete? If this was a challenge for athletic performance based on how well you've done in the past, would you do this? I said, and then the entertainment attorneys, same thing. And they all said, no way. I would never let our clients do it. We never do it, because you're signing away everything on the chance. It's like playing the lottery. You might win the $1 million, but you have a lot more to lose than $1 or $2 to play at this. So there was that. The other side of it is that one of the rules on the challenge was that technically you had to be tested by someone locally. Now, sometimes they let that bypass. If somebody like Natalia coming from Russia or from someplace else, they would skip that. But a lot of times you had to go through a local group first, and those people were not necessarily at all capable of doing a decent test, and they were just as dogmatic, if not more so, and more rabid than Randy's people. And it wasn't going to be a fair test, and they didn't have to have a fair test for the local thing. So a lot of folks could have tried and never gotten past that point, and Randy always had the opportunity to say, well, you didn't pass the local thing, I don't want to test you.
Not worth my time, right.
And he actually turned people down, too. The late Martin Caidin, who I worked with, he was a science and science fiction writer, actually the creator of The $6 Million Man. His book Cyborg became that. He was a technical advisor on the series. He was a consultant to NASA. This was the guy who was not a lightweight. He also could do psychokinesis. He could move things. And we tested him I worked with him for a few years before he died. Also had an experience with his ghost afterwards. That's a whole different story.
Oh, okay. We got to talk about that after.
But Marty showed me letters, because Marty lived in Florida, Randy lived in Florida. Marty was getting some notoriety even before I met him. And Randy wrote him a letter challenging him to go for, I think at that time, maybe the $10,000 prize. So it was before the $1 million challenge. And Martin Caidin was an incredibly bullheaded, larger-than-life character who wrote him back a letter saying, fine, I'll take the challenge, and I'll tell you what. If I can't do it, I'll pay you $10,000.
Ooh, money where the mouth is. Good.
Right. Randy wrote back and backed off. We assume it was because he made some comment about, well, if you're that sure of yourself, you must have a way to cheat.
Okay, right.
So he there were people that wanted to go for the challenge and even put up money or put up against Randy, and he just wouldn't accept them. So
right.
There was that piece of it as well. It's the challenge ended a few years ago. I was on Larry King back maybe a little more than 10 years ago, and it was actually I've got a little bit of that up on my YouTube channel, but it was a show that was stocked for Halloween. It was stocked with way too many people.
Yep.
Michael Shermer was on it in LA. Linda Blair was on it. They had all these people who had experiences, and Randy made some comment to a couple who I had done a segment with on Unsolved Mysteries.
Yep.
From up in Vancouver, Washington. And at one point, Randy said, "Well, you ought to have your haunted house go up from my $1 million challenge."
Mm-hmm.
And I made the comment immediately, well, your challenge doesn't apply to a haunted house.
Right.
At which point they cut off everybody's mic except when Larry wanted to talk to somebody.
Right.
So it was not uncommon for Randy to make those kinds of comments and claims.
Right.
Yeah. So basically, there is a very good reason why no one who works in the field of parapsychology, which I certainly do not, I'm no researcher, no one really takes or took Randy seriously. So for the people who do still want to make the claims that because nobody won James Randi's prize, that therefore everything about this stuff is already debunked. Well, I think I just showed what is probably the strongest reason why that just doesn't make sense: the contractual issues, and autonomy being all about business and whatnot. Contracts kind of matter just a little tiny bit. Should know what you're signing and know how to build a good contract and all this sort of stuff. So he apparently either didn't or purposely was very predatory or something, not really sure. So with all that out of the way, I do want to get into some of the very interesting things that remote viewing was able to be used for back when it was still a program being funded by the CIA.
Let's talk about some of the unusual successes that are possible in remote viewing. I know even though Hella Hammond seemed to perform statistically 10 times better than Pat Price, as I recall, Pat Price was able to read code words from a secured NSA facility, which was used as a target, I gather, by the CIA in some of their experiments, much to the consternation of the NSA.
That's right. A very early experiment that we did, Kit Green wanted to see if we could penetrate a facility that he had complete control over. He was confident that nobody in our lab at SRI knew anything about some place. And in fact, the place that, in full disclosure, the place that he had chosen was a log cabin built by one of his colleagues in West Virginia. And that log cabin was just over the hill, as they say, from the Sugar Grove top secret crypto NSA facility, using their microwave dishes to spy on the Russians. So both Pat Price and Ingo Swann were given the geographical coordinates of this place. Probably the coordinates would be indistinguishable from the log cabin, that the Sugar Grove was probably indistinguishable from the log cabin and the coordinates they were given. But both Pat Price and Ingo described the Sugar Grove great listening post with the big microwave dishes and government buildings. And Price went on to describe down in the basement is where the action is. He said there's a row of green filing cabinets. And I can read the names on the files, and it says this is something called 8-ball and rack up and pool cue and 14-ball, a whole bunch of things pertaining to billiards. And that's what I get. That's what he, together with some other words that I can't remember right now. But all of those appear in our film, Third Eye Spies, where we have the whole list of what Price was able to dig up from Sugar Grove. And we gave those to Kit Green, and he was shocked because he was looking for a log cabin. But since Pat and Ingo both described the same thing, he thought he would drive up, look at the log cabin, and follow the road past the log cabin. There was a guarded gate, and he's CIA, so he could go through the guarded gate. And he then saw the big dishes that the two psychics described, and then he asked inside at the appropriate security place, do you have something here called rack up and 8-ball and cue ball? And they said, oh my God, those are the code names of some top secret programs that are described down the files in the basement, the green filing cabinets. And Kit Green got to see the green filing cabinets. So it's as though Pat Price went to the coordinates, and as he described it, from 5,000 feet, he could see the cabin, but who cares about a log cabin? These secretive CIA guys wanted to know probably about the government facility. So he went into the government facility and went into the building. And he had total control over what was going on there and was able to read those things. And as you say, the NSA was angry, not with us so much, but with Kit Green. They wanted to know basically, why would you at the CIA have California psychics penetrate this top secret facility? Don't you know better than that? So we had a very acrimonious meeting of NSA and CIA and Pat Price at our facility. And the NSA guy turned to Pat and said, if you're so psychic, why didn't you go where the coordinates said? And he said, well, in psychic space, the more attention you have on hiding something, the more it shines like a beacon. And your facility was much more interesting than the log cabin.
Parenthetically, isn't it the case that after all of that happened, the Kit Green or others in the CIA decided that they wanted Pat Price to work directly for them rather than with you at SRI?
Well,
and I will leave that there because that is true. That did happen, but I'll let you investigate that on your own and what happened as a result. There is more fun that they got to have with the NSA. So in addition to be able to find secret facilities and whatnot that they certainly took seriously, there's this little gem.
NSA was interested in what we were doing, and they didn't want to show. I said we could read give us your best code. They said, we're not going to let you see any code. I said, no, we don't have to see it. Just send us something with your best code, put it in a top secret folder. We don't have to touch the folder or open it. You can give it to the classified receptionist. She'll just keep it in the safe, and we'll mark it read by Stargate and send it back to you. And that so freaked them out that they didn't want to even talk to us anymore. The idea that we not only didn't have to look at the code to try and break it, we did not even have to open the envelope.
Well, it seems like they took that pretty seriously back then. This is just one example, two examples of a number of amazing things that have done. Everything from busting ships that are carrying drugs and finding rogue DEA agents and a whole bunch of other stuff, rescuing people, like hostage situations, whatnot, or at least, providing information that led to it. And so you might be thinking, hey, so this is all happening in the 70s and 80s, and I guess some of the 90s as well, early 90s. Is there anything that's happening today now that all that information has been released, as evidenced by it being all over YouTube and whatnot? And yes, there is stuff happening. You can, in fact, set up a business with this.
Well, if one were to look at all of the potential applications, you've got military intelligence, you've got law enforcement cases, oil and minerals, financial, forecasting. We've talked about archaeological research. We've even talked about the possibility of using remote viewing for helping to develop new technologies.
Right, exactly.
Which of these applications do you think offers the most promise?
All the above is what I want to say.
Yeah.
I think that the best promise, I think, has to do with the open-mindedness of the normal American businessman.
Mm-hmm.
Any businessman can actually set this up himself and use it for the benefit of his business. If he just read a few lines about the protocol and tried to apply it in a way that actually isolated intent, I think that would work fine.
Now, you mean business people can become their own remote viewers?
Exactly right. Maybe not their own, since they're setting up the target.
Yeah.
But they could ask other people who are complete strangers to the issue to give them the information.
Because it is a team that's really required. In fact, I think you and I had a discussion earlier about the dangers of having a remote viewer judge their own response.
Oh my God, yes. And there are people out there who are making that recommendation as we sit here. And they're saying, and then you judge yourself. Well, I'm sorry, but the person who does the viewing has a certain prejudice based on what they've drawn or what they've said.
Yeah.
It's inevitable. They may not be thinking about it right then, but if they look at something to judge it against, they're going to see what they've written or drawn that's in that picture, and then in the next picture, and that's going to confuse them, because now which one is it really?
Yeah.
You know, they're going to wind up guessing. It's very destructive to the whole process.
Judging is an art in and of itself.
Yes, and the judge has to be blind too. Judge is blind, the analyst is blind, the remote viewer is blind, the monitor is blind.
How important is feedback?
Actually, in the beginning, we thought it was extremely important, because we weren't sure if it wasn't the remote viewer themselves sending the information to themselves in the past, which is another reason why you never want to show the remote viewer something that's varied from the actual target.
In other words, in many research studies, you're going to compare the transcript provided by a viewer against maybe a pool of potential
and
targets.
only one of them's correct.
Yeah.
Now, so it's essentially the same thing when you ask somebody to judge themselves.
Yeah.
They are now seeing two out of two possibilities.
Yeah.
How are they going to ever figure out what the psychic information was?
In other words, they're getting feedback about an inaccurate target.
On both, exactly.
Plus an accurate target.
Yeah.
So, but what if they get no feedback at all?
Indications from research over decades says it does not matter. All they need to know is it's important enough for them to work on.
Because, there's this model that people learn through feedback, but I think what you're saying is that model may not be applicable.
Exactly. And I guess a better model would be, let's just go back over it and see what tasted better to you than not. In other words, they're going to have to develop the methodology by which they're going to do their remote viewing. Way early in the Stargate program, they were asking me to do all kinds of things, go into an all-gray room, lay down on a couch, get your head right, just different things.
Yeah.
And part of it became kind of ridiculous. They put in soundproofing and sealed the windows off because the birds outside were too loud. Then you have squirrels running on the roof, so you have to put these bands up to keep the squirrels from jumping on the roof. And that's another thing, And they actually had a checklist.
Yeah.
Had probably 28 items on. Check the things that got in your way. Well, I carried that into my boss, the colonel, and I said, this is a list for failure. Look, I have a reason right here. Don't feel very good this morning. Got another reason. I said, this is an excuse sheet for failure. I don't want to see it again. I crumbled it up and threw it in his wastebasket.
Checklists are very popular.
Because they're easy to judge.
Yeah.
And I threw it in this trash can and said, I don't want... In fact, I'm going to do some of my viewing sitting right at my desk. Phones ringing, people yelling at each other, asking me if I want coffee, whatever. I'm going to do it at my desk, because if I can't do it there, I can't do it anywhere of value for the Army.
Mm-hmm.
See, I was a soldier.
Yeah.
And if you can't do remote viewing in the field under any circumstances, you're wasting your time. The Russians, in fact, their best viewer got a one of their highest peacetime. No, I think it was a combat ribbon, one of their highest combat ribbons. Their best remote viewer is a woman. She did all reviewing from a mainline battle tank.
Oh.
On site in Chechnya during the Chechen wars. I asked her, I said, what are you, crazy? You don't have to be there. You can be in Moscow in a beautiful, luxurious apartment. What are you doing in a tank in the middle of war? She said, well, they needed that to believe what I was giving them.
Oh.
Yeah, no excuses attitude, even in remote viewing. I do have a video here if people want to learn how to do a basic form of remote viewing for themselves. It ironically breaks some of the rules that Joe laid out of not judging yourself. However, as a training tool, I think it is valid. Who would like to see that video? Who would like to learn a little bit of how they can maybe apply this themselves?
Me, I'd like to see it.
Hooray! That's good, because yeah, you guys can absolutely apply this yourself, either through, for example, contracting a company like Problem Solutions Innovations, which I think is run by Lynn Buchanan, if I remember correctly, who was another one of the military remote viewers. There's a few out there, but you can learn how to do this yourself. And even though you definitely want to tighten up on your protocols, this is still a good start. I apologize ahead of time for the music, because it has music that I would not have chosen. Granted, I would have chosen none. Let's go.
Hi, I'm Paul H. Smith. For 7 years, I was a remote viewer and a remote viewing trainer in the military's Stargate remote viewing program, and I've been teaching remote viewing pretty much ever since. In this short video, I'm going to give you some tips on how to do a simple remote viewing session yourself. If you're not quite sure what remote viewing is, you may want to check out my video, Remote Viewing Martial Art for the Mind, first. Probably the best place to begin is to help you understand what remote viewing impressions are really like. They come in almost as if they're half-remembered memories. They have the same quality, the same feeling about them. They're vague, kind of fuzzy, but these are memories you know that you haven't had from before. These are new experiences that are coming in, new impressions that are coming in. You may get images, but these will be fuzzy and indistinct, rather vague. And sometimes you'll just get a sort of sudden knowing. You know something is here at the target, for example, but you won't know how you know that. Bright, vivid images are usually your conscious mind guessing, so don't trust those too much. When you're ready to get going, you'll need a black ink pen, a few sheets of paper, and a quiet place to work. And you'll need a target. But the remote viewer has to be blind to the target. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to wear a blindfold. What it means is that the remote viewer can't know what the target is or know anything about the target before or during the remote viewing session. They only get to find out what the target is afterwards. This is so you won't be accused of cheating, but it also avoids what we call mental noise, which is everything you know or might be able to guess about the target, if you know what it is, flooding into your mind and swamping all of the subtle signal, which is the actual information you want to get. What that means is you may need to involve a second person in the process so you as the viewer can stay blind to whatever the target is. For a beginning remote viewing, the target can just be a photo on a piece of paper or maybe an object that somebody puts in a box and tapes closed. Once the target has been sealed in the envelope or taped into the box, the person creating the target will want to label it in a way that won't give away anything about its contents, but will serve as a designator so the viewer's consciousness can identify where the target is. Writing target 1 or whatever target number you're on the box or envelope is sufficient. The envelope or the box can be in the same room with the viewer, or it can be in a different room, or it could be in another location different altogether. The label written on the target serves as a kind of address to draw the viewer's consciousness to it. To get the ball rolling, you just have to sit down at a table with a paper and pen. The first thing you'll want to do is write your name, the date, and if you feel like it, the time down in the upper right-hand corner of the page. If you have any distractions that might get in your way, such as maybe an appointment you have later that you have to remember, or maybe you're nervous about doing your first remote viewing session, you can just write those down, note them briefly in the upper left-hand corner of the page, or put them on a separate sheet of paper. Now, what do you need to know to be able to remote view? Let's talk it over. The first thing you need to remember, and it's the hardest thing to do, is to relax. Why do I say it's the hardest thing to do? Because whenever you try something new, there's a little bit of tension involved. There's a little bit of uncertainty. You don't know how you're going to do, and you worry about that. Don't worry about it. Just relax and let it happen. If you are concerned that you may not do well on it, nobody has to see your results. If you do well, then you'll have something to brag about. So remember, relax. The next thing to keep in mind is related to this idea of relaxing, and it is, don't worry about whether you succeed or fail. In our society, we are conditioned to worry about whether we're going to succeed at something or worry about whether we're going to fail at that same thing. In remote viewing, worrying about succeeding and failing, being overly concerned with that, is actually going to lead to you having a hard time. There's this, what I, for many years now, have referred to as the Zen-like element in remote viewing. In Zen, the idea is that you concern yourself with the process, not with the outcome. And that's how you want to approach remote viewing, where you are kind of an interested observer of what's happening as you're going through this process. And you'll see what the outcome is when it happens, and then you'll evaluate it at that point. You don't worry about it as you're going through. If you can let go of that need to succeed or let go of that fear of failure, you'll find yourself succeeding far more often. The final step in preparation is essentially to clear your mind. Now I say clear, and I put it in quotes here, because no one can actually totally clear their mind of thoughts or impressions or whatever may come in. What you're doing, you're not exactly clearing your mind. What you're doing is allowing whatever comes in to flow back out again. You're trying to avoid holding on to these thoughts and stressing about them. So as a thought comes in, you let it flow out. If it's a thought that may have to do with the target, then you allow that to flow in and you put it on the paper. Either write it down or sketch it if it's something you sketch. If it's something that doesn't have anything to do with the target, you let it go entirely. That's all there is to clearing your mind. When you start the actual remote viewing process, all you do is record impressions that you get. And simple, basic impressions are what you want to go for first. Things like colors, textures, qualities of light. Is it shiny or is it dull? Is it red or is it brown? Or is it a combination of all these things? If the target isn't a photo, if it's something else like an object, you may get taste, smells, even maybe sounds if it's something that could make a sound. You track these simple impressions. As you get into the session, you'll start perceiving shapes. You'll start maybe getting lines and directions. Capture all that on paper. But focus on the simple stuff. Don't try and figure out what this target is right off the bat, because your left brain, your conscious mind, will step in and give you suggestions that are usually wrong. An important rule in this process is that surprises often turn out to be right. And what do I mean by surprise? I mean something pops into your head that you weren't thinking about, that isn't connected to anything you're thinking about. It just suddenly materializes in your mind. There's a very high likelihood that whatever that is that your impression is true about the target. So make sure you record anything that surprises you, an impression that you weren't expecting that comes into your mind. One very important element is sketching. Sketching is a way we have of getting out internal impressions that we can't express in words. And so some people tend to default to writing words down all the time. Remember to sketch the impressions that come into your mind, because you can get things down on paper using a sketch, drawing a picture, so to speak, that you can't express verbally. Sketches are very important, have been shown to be a very important intrinsic aspect of the remote viewing process. Finally, remember to keep drawing your attention back to the target. Human perception is designed for our attention to wander, and you'll find yourself drifting off of the target and start thinking about other things. You'll have to periodically remind yourself to go back and address the target, go back and think about the target, go back and try and perceive the target, and that will help you stay on course in the process of remote viewing. When you're finally ready to start, you simply write target 1, or whatever the target number is, on the left side of the sheet, and you begin. If impressions come to you immediately, write or sketch them immediately. Waiting to think them over first can lead to your conscious mind inventing things or making you doubt. Sometimes it may take a few moments for you to begin to recognize the vague impressions forming in your mind. Relax and let it happen. But make sure you write or sketch everything as it emerges into your thoughts. You may at first just perceive colors or shapes, and if the target is a physical object, as I said, you might even get things like textures or smells or tastes, or maybe even sounds. But as you go on, shapes and lines will start to emerge. It's very important to sketch those on your paper and capture them. For your first remote viewing effort, maybe 5 minutes would be enough. But if you still seem to be doing well, don't stop right there. Go ahead and keep working until you feel like you're done. When you're finished, simply write "end" and the time at the bottom of your final page. Now you can check out your feedback. Open the envelope or the box, see what the target is. Compare what you got to what it is you're supposed to be remote viewing. That's all there is to it. Who knows, you may have so much fun that you'll want to go on and explore remote viewing in depth. If you want more information on how to do this and other simple remote viewing experiments, or get guidance on how to find professional training, you may want to get my book, The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, or you can access my website at rviewer.com. Thanks for watching.
And there we go. Now you should have the very basics of what remote viewing is, criticism against it and why they may not be valid, what it can be used for and how you can do it yourself. And yeah, you absolutely can use it for business. People do. I mean, if it's good enough to freak the NSA out, I think it's probably good enough to make some money with. In fact, I probably could have added this in. I think about it as one of the clips. They used to use it. They did experiments with it for silver trading and making a bunch of money doing that and speculation on the stock market. But yeah, there's a whole lot you can do with it. And with that, I think I will open the floor to everyone else. And before I find out that nobody could hear anything.
Okay, I would love to thank you, Ryan, for that. And I have no problem understanding and tracking that. In fact, I took a class with Lynn McTaggart. I'm going to guess you know of her, and she does work.
Yep.
Yeah, she's very good at this, and she does work in the field. And I took a course with her and have direct experience with this. And if anyone is skeptical because you haven't had direct experience, I understand that. But once you have direct experience, there is no question how this field is accessible, and it's there whether we experience it or not. It's something that everyone can access, and if you relax and allow yourself to have this experience, it's there, no question.
Is this
Speaking of, so go ahead.
Sorry, is this what people mean when they say, like, I had a download?
Probably not. Remote viewing specifically is the protocol. So it's not like the download thing that would come under. I don't know which that would come under. That could very well come under a thing called peak experiences, but that could be something totally different. No, remote viewing is purposeful. That's the big difference. It's targeted. It's purposeful. It doesn't typically show up as a giant download in one shot or anything like that.
But maybe
that is probably related. I'm of the opinion that a lot of these things are all basically the same mechanisms, and that people have split them up because they look different on the surface. But yeah, that is technically considered different than remote viewing.
when Dave said the field is there, whether you experience it or not, that's what made me wonder, because I was watching the Exit and Build Summit the other day, and Cynthia Tina said that some stuff just came to her. She got this big download. And so that reminded me of that.
And that's why I was gonna jump in when Dave said that, because there is a theory in parapsychology now called first sight theory, and the idea is that regardless of whether people are trying to do any of this stuff or not, they're always having effect, whether it's a small psychokinetic effect or whatever. And this has actually been tested and seems to have some validity to it, where even if you're not trying to do anything, you can set up, random number generators and things to select pictures and whatnot. And they find that even in times when they're not trying to do anything, they're still seemingly affecting this random number generator. A related study would have been the Global Consciousness Project. Some people have some issues with some of its methodologies, but overall it seemed pretty good, which seemed to look at the same type of stuff, in which would provide more of that sort of evidence that there is something out there all the time, always acting, or also, I guess it wouldn't necessarily be something out there, but it's also something in you, a capability in you that's always active, whether you're trying to use it or not. And all that people, for example, with remote viewing are trying to do is just tap into that. And that's a thing they found. There's a whole story I could go into about when they tried to bring a control into the lab to find someone who wasn't psychic. That person was Hella Hamid, and Hella Hamid was, as you may have heard at the early part of one of those clips, immediately started getting 10 times the results that Pat Price was getting, and she was the control. So what they were finding was this seems to be a thing anyone can do. Everyone has this ability, even when they're supposed to be assigned to the control and have never heard of any of this stuff or even thought of it. So yeah, it really does seem to be everywhere.
Yeah, that was actually what I was just thinking, Ryan. So I don't know if you got that from ESP or what, but I was thinking that very thing. But what I would say is, what's interesting is in a lot of cases, these guys are using the scientific method probably more scrutinizing than most of the scientists these days in the, what we're calling the scientific arena. I think that's notable. And then I would also say that Bob Podolsky's work with sociopolycentric and the octologs, the studies that he did with John David Garcia was with something called autopoiesis, where they got a group of people together and they essentially did something relatively similar to that, and essentially generated ideas just out of the blue kind of stuff. So I don't know, there's some things that are obviously different, but certainly sounds like the same thing.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that, they were probably putting together stuff that was better than what we consider mainstream science. If you were actually asked Jessica Utz, who was at one time the head of the American Statistical Association, and who was tasked with reviewing all of the remote viewing data in 1995, 1996, thereabouts, that's what she would say. She has said that on interviews, actually, where the parapsychological experiments are put together better than a lot of like mainstream stuff. And one of the theories is that, well, because people have looked at it with so much skepticism for so long that it's all just nonsense and it can never be, therefore it must all be fraud, that these people have had to go to extreme lengths to put in such tight controls to deal with those people, like any of those criticisms, that now they're putting out, in some cases, some of the best built studies in the world. In fact, the entire practice of pre-registering an experiment, where you have to, before you even run it, you actually, you pre-register and say, this is what I'm going to do to have that checking. That comes from parapsychology. That's now the standard in medicine, but that originally came from parapsychology, that practice.
Well, I wonder you've seen Richard's model of like that intuitive, like the big world thinking versus the small world thinking, and the kind of the intuitive to the logical and back and forth kind of thing. Do you feel like this fits into that model?
Yeah. I tend to consider it all. I mean, I'm big on, I guess I'm not going to call myself a reductionist, because that typically means something very different than what I'm meaning. I try to take things and reduce them to the smallest, most common thing possible so that they're easy to mentally work with. This is, as it turns out, what the quadrivium is almost certainly based on. The quadrivium is something I think people really should use a whole lot more, because that's exactly what it does. So to me, it's all logic. I don't want to separate it as an intuition and logic or any of that stuff. I just see it as different applications of logic. Because otherwise, when you start splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting and saying these things are all in different categories, it can get very messy and it can be hard to work with. But generally speaking, I would say, yeah, it fits into that model very well. You have different parts of your mind, different parts of your body, et cetera, that are better at doing things that other parts aren't so good at. So if you let them do that and not get in their way, then you're probably going to have a much better result. And so that, I think, is really what it comes down to, or what the cycle between sort of logic and intuition would really work well for, and what it potentially really means.
The quadrivium being arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, I think.
Yeah, I'd reduce that even further, actually. Yeah, number in space, number in time in space. What I would actually reduce it to is I would just say it's different applications and amalgamations of number, time, and space. So instead of 4 things, it'd be 3. And technically, since you can represent time and space as numbers, even if they're number matrices or whatever, you could reduce it all as just being number. Next is different applications of number. And the advantage of doing that is what in the real world, the physical world that you're interacting with, that can interact with you, does not fall into one of those categories. And so you can start to see similarities and ways things can combine and coalesce and everything in the real world that you otherwise might miss, because otherwise you're seeing all these separate things. But when you realize it all kind of comes down to, number, basically, number in time, number in space, all that sort of stuff, you can start to go, this thing is related to this thing in this way. And it's, it's a lot easier to work with and not overload yourself with either. Don't know if that makes any sense. I hope it does.
Well, I find it interesting, that discussion about the feedback, and certainly in some instances, feedback in a logical sense is very useful. I mean, that's kind of one of the things that makes the hierarchy a bad model, is its lack of feedback. But in the sense of like developing these other things, and I don't know, would you call them senses? Are these other things senses, like additional senses?
I mean, probably. I don't think it's incorrect to say, it would be technically incorrect to say it's a 6th sense, because people already have a bunch of other senses, like sense of balance and stuff. Like there's other senses that people don't consider senses, but actually do exist. But nonetheless, as an extra sense, yeah, I'd say it's still there. And I don't think it's remotely paranormal. At this point, there's so much evidence for it and similar things that to consider it that, I think, is just kind of ridiculous. One of my favorite examples of that is there's a type of experiment called the Ganzfeld study, which is essentially a sense deprivation experiment with telepathy. And the short version of it is that when you go through and take all the various Ganzfeld studies that have been done, testing for telepathy in this case, and you do a meta-analysis on them, and you do the statistics, it comes out to something in the effect of 29 quintillion to 1 against chance. So like in terms of the odds of like, hey, is this psi or not, and or psychic function or not. And so when you're starting to deal with numbers like that, the idea that it's not a thing is kind of insane. So I would say when you're starting to deal with that, it's like, yeah, it probably is just another normal sense. It's just one that people have either atrophied in their use of, or any number of other things. There's some theories that this is actually a very old sense, and that it has actually decayed over time as technology has increased. As the joke goes, even the best mediums still use a cell phone. So you know, they don't need those senses so much as they may have been useful for like hunter-gatherer societies. But nonetheless, it does seem to be there.
May I add on to that, please, to what Michael said about the sense? And my understanding is that the five senses that you referred to are in the physical realm and domain. And what we're discussing are additional senses in the energetic realm. And energy is at a higher frequency. By the time you're talking about physical things, my understanding is that's a pretty dense thing, and our senses are excellent at making reality in the physical world. But then there's this whole other energetic realm, and so there are other senses that people have that some are really good at. Some people can hear well, some people can see well, and then in the energetic senses, some people can do remote viewing well, and some people might be able to get downloads well and see in different time areas. But I agree with what Ryan said. It's really just all one thing here. There's just only the one, and there's different aspects of that. That's what I get.
Yeah, I'd agree. Even in research, they tend to find that, well, I guess I can't really say this one for research, but it's like the reports for example, people who have near-death experiences, which in this case is defined as you have a heart attack or something, and then you, in some very rare cases, seem to have an out-of-body experience as part of that. It's not uncommon for some of those people to report as if the only sense they have is this sort of psychic sense, that they don't, that the way things show up is no longer amenable to normal senses. But that's not always the case. It's kind of clouded away. But that does seem to be a common thing, as if the normal five senses are really only for the body, but there's this extra one that is sort of universal. But I would say the jury's still very much out on that because of just, it gets messy. But yeah.
I guess I'd also relate that to, some of the things that I heard, and not necessarily in this presentation, in the presentation you made on Tuesday. One of the things that the first gentleman that you had talked about was, kind of the attachment of the emotion and the attachment of intent, and then how that relates to the confidence that the remote viewer has, related to the video that we saw in the lecture a week ago from Ivan Joseph, the soccer coach, where he was talking about how do you get the highest performance out of the team. And it was essentially really along these lines, where he wasn't talking about, giving them feedback about what they were doing wrong, but just demonstrating what they were doing right and building their confidence. That's essentially what he said in that other video that you played on Tuesday night. And to a large degree, I would think that, that video that you played about how to remote sense, that thing about getting rid of the success and failure, the outcome, as I think that just goes across all lines, when it comes to really building your confidence in yourself, is stepping away from those, invalid criteria, really.
Well, the way I like to say it is that, yeah, you want the result, but the way you get the result is the effort. So it doesn't make any sense to care about the result. You might as well care about the effort, because it's the thing that gets you the result. So it seems counterintuitive, because it's like, well, I care about the result. It's like, well, then you have to care about the effort. But see, people don't always see that. But yeah, it's the same idea. And I would agree.
That also relates to the Guy Ritchie interview, where he's talking about the suit of armor, and essentially like what you do every day. It's not so much about the goal, the outcome. It's about how you practice that really delivers.
Agreed. I think that it's all about the process, unattached to the outcome.
Yeah, that's sometimes easier said than done, but it is nonetheless still something that seems to be almost universally effective. It was funny, actually. Well, not totally different track. There is other psychological research on this from a totally different angle. There was a book that I was reading at one time called The Wisdom of Psychopaths, which is an interesting book, but they're talking about that tendency for people with like clinical psychopathy. They don't see consequences, and as a result, they'll just go and do stuff. And they had the psychologist who was writing the book, as part of writing this book, he used what's it called? They were able to use this technology called transcranial stimulation, if I remember correctly, to, as he put it, give his brain an electromagnetic comb over for a bit to reduce that, to basically, for a limited period of time, make him, I guess, less consequence driven. And so he reported that during that time, he would go and he was playing a game in an arcade called Gran Turismo, if I remember correctly, and he just blew past his previous high scores. And he had all these other great successes in his life for like a month until this wore off. But it seemed to come from this, this like, I'm not caring about the goal, the outcome. So there was a lot of study on like, well, who are the best surgeons in the world, and who are the best lawyers in the world, and who are the best whatever. And basically what they were finding is all of them technically fell somewhere on like the psychopathic personality index, but the commonality was they could be unattached to those outcomes. They weren't being affected by their emotions so much, so they could just perform really well. The best surgeons were like, doing this just as, like, the people who were helping the most people were doing it just as well as the people who weren't. And it was a really fascinating book that I recommend, because it actually has a whole lot of this stuff in it, more than you'd think.
Well, that's interesting, because that's the, kind of the military's approach when it comes to the elite forces. Essentially, they're looking for the psychopaths because those are the ones that perform regardless of the situation. They just do their job.
Yeah. That was presumably, historically, that was the idea. That's the theory behind the Viking berserkers, is that they were berserkers were universally some form of psychopath, because they would go and do this analysis of, here's how they performed in a fight, but here's what happened when there wasn't a war going on, and what they would do to everyone around them. And so it looks like those people were probably not well, I can't say not all there, but it's like they were probably higher up on that scale. But it's sort of a thing. It's like, but if you can harness it, if you can, turn it on and off and control it, and not be, not go to the dark side, or however you want to put it, it's like, it's something that is extremely good for any form of productivity. And all it really comes down to is the same style of stuff, where it's more like, if you take that one component out of it, where it's like the not being unattached outcomes and not really caring about what happens type of thing. If you can do that in a balanced way, like, your productivity would go through the roof, I would assume. The point of me bringing all that up is that you see this in other areas than just meditation and stuff like that. It's more universal than that.
Yeah, there's kind of a principle in real estate development where and Danny Lilly, I think he just repeated this in our last think tank discussion we had this past week, was don't fall in love with the project. Essentially always remain kind of neutral to you just want good investments. You don't necessarily want to like fall in love with the vision of what you think it could be. And that's it's very interesting. It goes across a lot of different fields for sure.
You see this, I know, Dave, you had posted a thing at one point in the forum about the being unshakable, which more or less says the same thing, like be neutral, and if I remember correctly.
Sure, that's a great example of, and the mind narration is, that's why I like being relaxed, and the first thing that comes in before your mind can start to think it knows something that isn't true. Our minds play around with things that beyond, anyway, the mind narrative and all that noise gets in the way of this remote viewing or tapping into the field, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, well, a lot of the exercises there, like I had a bunch of clips I could have chosen for some of this stuff, and I chose that one because it was complete. But the thing is that a lot of the exercises you do for that are they're not quite universal, but they help with anything perceptual, I would argue. And so they're more useful than just for remote viewing. I mean, this is the stuff that I do. I don't do remote viewing personally. That's not what I'm interested in, at least not yet. My interest is in all the psychokinetic stuff, getting that to work myself. And then ideally, I would like to teach that. And I would want to put courses and stuff out on that, but I would have to be able to prove it first. However, even with that, a lot of the stuff that he says for how to do proper remote viewing, it still applies. You still have to do exactly that stuff. So that sort of speaks, in my opinion, more to the universality of it. And generally speaking, I would almost guarantee if people started doing that stuff just in general, they're probably just going to notice a lot more intuitive hits anyways, regardless of whether they're trying to do it or not. It'll probably just start happening. And I personally think that is worth it just on its own, even if you have no other interest.
Well, I have a question for you, Ryan. From your experience and direct experience, bringing other people in and trying to do remote viewing, like if a lot of, like for example, Lynn McTaggart had this power of 8. If you get 8 people and focus on the same thing, whether it be a target or somebody in the group, each time we could do remote healings with 8 people, and it was very powerful. Like someone in the group would mention her mom was sick, and could we focus our anyway? Power of 8, bringing in more people to tune into one thing. What is your experience with that, please?
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I actually at one time got to be part of a study on exactly that. So I got our group. I don't know if I should really make this fully as a claim, but basically a lady went from having, I think it was a diagnosis of 6 months to live with cancer, to her cancer levels went below the level of having cancer. So I'm not going to sit here and say we cured her of cancer, but apparently, so it was reported to us anyways, that her doctor was like, what's going on? Then decided to give her a precautionary round of chemo, which then subsequently killed her, unfortunately, but that's apparently a very common story with this stuff. But yeah, so we got to do that. Basically what the research had shown was that more people seems to matter. But in other areas of research with parapsychology, that's not always the case. It's more like you need the right people. If you just throw a bunch of people in, but nobody likes each other, like liking each other, actually, I think was one of the biggest things. If people liked each other, then they did better. If they had a larger group. But that's the thing that you can see in other areas where it's like you can have a disruptive effect. You can bring in more people and it's actually not better, it's worse. And that's probably why they try to focus on joy, for example, in a lot of these types of groups, to get everyone happy, because then it seems to help. But yeah, it does seem to make a difference. I actually, every second Thursday, I'm still part of the original group, or at least what remains of it, from that program. We've been trying to continue it, and we all sort of think back to like when we would have 8 or sometimes 12 people, and it's like it was so different, and we just can't get that anymore. And it in my opinion speaks to the idea that there is a concept of energy happening with this. Like in terms of research, what they seem to say is, or what they're willing to say is, well, we think it's like information. That's like the thing they're willing to say. I tend to contest that, because if it really was pure information, you'd see effects that ignored scale, and you don't. You see this very generic, like small things are easier to do than big things, and amount of people matters. Well, if amount of people matters, that seems to imply that each person has like a certain output of energy, energy in the sense of like joules, like, kinetic energy or force or whatever, if you want to measure it. And therefore, the more people you have, and if it's all sort of aligned together, then the more of an effect you have. And that's what you tend to see. And so that's not too surprising, at least to me. And then you could get into a bunch of other concepts like one of my favorite is energy density or condensation. So if you have that disruptive effect, which some people suspect might be why you don't see really large scale, like common macro psychokinetic effects, even though they do seem to happen in like very isolated locations and stuff. That might be because the wider public is constantly putting out like a dampening field that makes that dampens all that down. And therefore, if you can condense your energy, then you should be able to, you essentially make it harder, and it should be more resistant to that. I call it the river rock analogy. If you take like a rock in a river and it weighs a pound, how much water has to flow over that rock to erode it? It's going to be a whole lot more than a pound, and it's only because the rock is just more tightly bound together. But that's a thing that I haven't really seen a lot of people work on too much, and that's the specific thing I want to work on.
Are you familiar with heart math and the meditations that they do with energy?
Nope.
Into the noosphere? They do very large scale work all over the planet. And in fact, Joe Dispenza, who we are all intimately familiar with, he does some work with Lynn McTaggart and Greg Braden and these other, and Rupert Sheldrake. I bet you've heard of him, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And so these people are very familiar with this energy, but it's like so many of these other things, it's so challenging to get the mainstream to even acknowledge any of this. Rupert Sheldrake does a lot of experiments, and he got kicked out of the whole education department everywhere because for them to accept what he is saying and coming to terms with knowing, with his innate knowing, they would have to get rid of all their textbooks or rewrite everything.
Well, that's what they think. That people say that, but the reality is that's not true. And that's what people like Dean Radin, for example, point out. It's like, no, you don't have to get rid of all the textbooks. You know, in the same way that physics is beneath chemistry, which is beneath like molecular biology or whatever. You know, you would just say, they think consciousness is beneath it. I don't agree with that, because the way they just say it, but it's like, well, what does that mean? And what they then describe is something that just sounds like a neutral substance. And it's like, well, then how is that consciousness? And so I tend to see that as almost like a cop-out answer. Nonetheless, you know, it is the thing that they tend to say.
Could you connect the dots there? I lost the tracking of when you say what they say, and could you connect the dots?
So for like Dean Radin, for example, would say that, no, you don't need to rewrite the textbooks. Everything we've learned about physics is fine. All you're really saying is that there's a thing underneath physics, which is what science has always done. Is oh, we had Newtonian mechanics, and then, you know, we found that there's this whole other thing called quantum mechanics, and they're somehow related in ways that nobody has figured out yet. You know, or you could have like, you know, you had biology, and before they understood that there was bacteria, before that guy in Scotland, I think it was, figured out microscopes and all that stuff. Well, then they didn't know that. And then they found, oh, there's bacteria and stuff. So that's underneath like macrobiology. So that was microbiology, you know, and then you have viruses and stuff underneath that. Which
right.
Yeah.
So we're in agreement then, because Dean Radin and all these other people, they're not saying you have to rewrite books. They're adding on to, but it's the people who kick them out of the present educational institutions are saying, no, we can't allow you to come in and talk about this, or we would have to rewrite everything. It would make So I think, yes, we're in alignment. Thank you for that.
And that's why I want to do presentations like this. Because I really I'm like, no one's going to, reality is I've had way too many of my own experiences, none of which I'm going to put on YouTube here for obvious reasons. For anyone who's heard any of them, that like, you're not going to convince me that this stuff isn't real. Like as I like to say, I used to have the wounds to prove it. Like, you're not going to tell me it didn't happen. But you know, I'm not going to take that as I'm not going to take that at face value. I've also done a whole lot of my own research, my own experimentation stuff, and then I tie it back to people with more accreditation than me, which is why for this presentation, I just let them say it. I'm not going to tell you about the remote viewing program and Sugar Grove and all this stuff. I'll let Russell Targ, who started the program or co-founded the program, tell you, of like what happened. I'd rather, let Joe McMoneagle, talk about remote viewing, rather than me.
Beautiful.
And if people have a problem with it, they can take it up with him, basically.
I, for one, thank you for this presentation and bringing this to out, and it goes as far as it can go. And I thank you for this. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
I'd just like to add, so this is kind of one of the things that, from me observing you, Brian, over the past few years, coming into autonomy and then, presenting this on a weekly basis, how is this the community that is autonomy helping you get to where you need to be?
I am amazed at the amount of support the community has given me. Actually, I tend to have the attitude of I'm going to do it regardless of what anyone thinks or says. And I've done that for a long time. So it's surprising to me the amount of support I've gotten, because I'm usually thinking I'm going to get no support and everyone's going to be against me, because that's often been the case. It's only really been the last few years in general that people seem to have really started opening up about this stuff. And it's really weird to see, given how long I've been involved in one way or another, or I guess more accurately, how long it's been involved with me. But, so the community with autonomy, like the reality is, like practical parapsychology wouldn't exist without the people who kept, like I tell people individual stories of mine and things I've done or things that have happened and all that stuff. And they would be like, you got to put this in a podcast. And I would just constantly be like, no, I'm not going to do that. Certainly, I'm not going to put in a podcast, put on like YouTube or anywhere public, just because of the the nature of a lot of my experiences and whatnot. But the reality is that their constant prodding is why practical parapsychology even exists. So that's sort of the testament to the community, and it seems that people really like it. The people who've showed up, specifically you in particular, because you've shown up for, I think, every one of them that I've done, Michael, and everyone else who's listened to any of the recordings. And people like it more than I thought they would. So, that's good. It seems I'm doing something okay, I guess.
Well, I would say, go ahead.
Ryan, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Have you looked into the International Remote Viewing Association at all?
I know it exists, but I haven't really looked into it. And again, part of this because I personally am not planning on doing remote viewing yet, or anything like that yet. I want to focus on the physical stuff first, even though that's like exponentially harder. It's the stuff I want to look into first. But I do know they exist. And if you have a follow-up to that, I would definitely like to hear it.
Well, the reason I was asking is that a lot of the viewers that are professional viewers, and many of them that have come out through the US military projects for remote viewing, have been part of this organization. It's kind of an interesting group of people. And actually what's kind of interesting is if there's anybody, the tie-in for spiritual people here is that in Buddhism, they talk about the subtle bodies that people have. And for remote viewing, I really do believe that you use your spiritual subtle body in order to achieve some of these things. Clairvoyance is different than this, because if you're actually using a body that can be seen by somebody else who is also doing the same thing, then there's a whole package of realities that come along with this. And so people who are remote viewers have a peril. There's things that can go wrong when you're on the other side. And I'm not really sure if this organization, if they talk about the ways that people protect themselves, usually what I noticed is that they say they just like take off as fast as they can so they can't be traced, because you become a target if you're remote viewing. especially if it's.
I have yet to hear that one, actually. I've yet to hear, any of the people who I know were part of the program talk about that. So
there's
I
people
do
on-
wonder. Go ahead, sorry.
There's people, Dick Alligator, who has a YouTube station called Crypto Viewing, actually has remote viewers, and he'll every year there's a test, and he's looking for remote viewers because in Hawaii they actually have a remote viewing school there where they teach people how to be remote viewers. And we're not talking about, I'm going to take a 12-week course or a year course. Most of the people that actually do this are longtime students. And, I think Dick has done more than 10 years of remote viewing. But among remote viewers, people do talk about different aspects of being out there and feeling like they've been watched. And
That wouldn't surprise me too much. Go ahead, sorry.
And so it's kind of, it can be, I wouldn't do it by myself by any means. You need to have somebody that has been in that situation before. They know how to sort of get out of that spot if you do get caught. And then there's a whole nother level of understanding that I think is already written up, like in the Book of the Dead, that the Tibetans actually had looked at that stuff and how that all works. So, I mean, it doesn't have any proof in the sense of any studies or statistics, but it is one of the ways that I know people have experimented with remote viewing.
Yeah, like I would personally, I can't really have a judgment on it too much because there's a few issues that do come up these days with this all. Is one, there's a lot of people who say they do remote viewing that has nothing to do with the original military protocols. They're just saying it. It's just a term they're using. So I'd have to check that. It's like I have to check his pedigree. Like, is this guy really from a program like he says it is? For example, in one of the interviews with Joe McMonagle that I used as clips in here, he talks about how, as soon as all this stuff hit the internet, essentially, or hit the public in 1996, there's so many people who started popping up claiming to have been part of this military remote viewing program. And he's like, I don't know, like we had maybe 3,000 people, that were part of it. I worked with 50 people. We all knew each other. I don't know any of these people. Like it, and he's very loud apparently about about questioning them on that. And because remote viewing has almost become a term that's like, well, psychic is a dirty term, but people know that remote viewing was a thing the government paid for, so we'll use remote viewing instead. That sort of muddies it a bit. Now, that being said, you do have some of the people who are more credible who have like Lynn Buchanan is the one I'm going to use an example here, who do report interesting extra things that sometimes have happened during viewings. I do not remember the specific flight number of the I think it was a bombing that he was reviewing back in like the 70s or 80s or whenever. But basically he talks about this in an interview where he was, he was tasked to view this plane, bombing or crash or whatever it was. But as part of that, he claimed to have seen like essentially the people coming out of their bodies, like their spirits coming out, and then they like seem to. I can't remember off the top of my head now if he said they seemed to notice him, but that wouldn't surprise me because this was all part of a string of talks where he also talked about how what happens if you get really sucked into the target to the point where like you can feel the wind on your face and the sand between your toes type of thing, like except if you're actually there. Stuff like that is why I suspect that things like remote viewing, or at least some of the process of it, is similar or has the same underlying mechanics of things like out-of-body experiences. Because that seems to be what they're or projection. Like I don't like the astral part of astral projection because it's such a loaded term, but I do like the projection part because it does seem to describe, at least in my experience, what's actually happening. But nonetheless, for my personal experience anyways, yeah, I'm very well aware that there's, you kind of do have to be a bit careful with projection somewhat. People like Graham Nichols, who works a lot, who's done a lot of research with out-of-body experiences, which is, he seems to define it as what I would define as projection. But nonetheless, he claims that, he's never heard of a credible case of someone having issues, like genuine issues with it. I would contest that. Again, I used to have the wounds to prove it. But yeah, I do think there could be something to it. But there's a big debate as well for remote viewing is remote viewing the passive version where you're passively getting information, thus nothing of you is really going out? Or is remote viewing the same thing as projection or out-of-body experience in some ways where you presumably anyways are sending something to the target? And nobody really knows. Nonetheless, I basically would say there could be something to what you're saying. I don't have enough information to fully judge it, but there's enough there that I'm willing to say, yeah, it's possible. Why not? Something to look out for, if nothing else.
Uh-huh. Well, from watching Dick, I actually did he had described that protocol when he was doing a contest this year. And it's the same protocol that you showed us in the video clip. So I think the cat's out of the bag.
Yep, pretty much.
So, some of these people are really good people that come through the International Remote Viewing Association, and they seem to get their targets right and with good detail. And Dick Elliger is one of those people. So I would look into that if you're interested in remote viewing. They do consider their protocol important so that people can actually be safe. I actually have a background where I went to the Berkeley Psychic Institute, and there's a few people that were doing some remote viewing on their own without having any protocol or protection, so to speak, that ended up being crazy. They made themselves crazy.
Yeah, actually, speaking of that, I can't remember if it was Lynn Buchanan or if it was Joe McMonagle or who it was. They talked about in the military, they had a psychiatrist like on staff to give them like constant, not therapy, but like constant checkups to see like if they were making these people insane because of these experiences being so mind-boggling in some ways compared to what people would normally think of. And so that was a legitimate risk they were taking very seriously. So yeah, that's actually a good one to bring up. Sorry if I keep interrupting you. You should not do that.
That's fine. Well, so does anybody else have anything to add to this?
Or even just questions or comments or anything.
Yeah, I kind of have like a question / comment. I wanted to explore like how you had mentioned like the universality of applying this like openness or intuition or like detachment from the results. And so I kind of wanted to explore like how you can apply that to different uses. Like, for example, I signed up for a sales call yesterday for launch consultants. And the woman was really good at just not saying like, oh, I know what you should do. I know what you're doing. I understand everything. And just like asking a lot of questions. And so I think that really applies to like, if you're on a sales call and you're trying to understand what a prospect's goals are and their experiences and everything. But what about if you like, where's the line between the openness and detachment from results and like going after your goals? Like, for example, I have a goal to help parents with their homeschooling. And I don't want to get too detached from that because that's my purpose, like, so I don't know. I'm just wondering how we can apply this to different uses.
Well, I mean, for the sales call example, that one's actually relatively easy in that, like, say you need X. I know this is already sort of a solved problem in autonomy for some of the ways they deal with that specific one, in that, like, say you need 10 calls a day, like 10 successful calls in some period of time, then it kind of becomes just a matter of math of just, okay, you have to just do a bunch of calls. Like, you need to think in terms of like, I'm just going to do say 100 calls. regardless of outcome, chances are more that, chances are one or more of those is going to become a success, and you can add that to your successful. So that'd be a way of doing it. And then at that point, it's about efficiency. But again, that's more like looking at the effort. So for the homeschooling thing, it'd be like, well, what are the steps required? Like you take, what is the final result? What does that look like? And then you can work backwards and like deconstruct it of what its components are. It's like, okay, well, then I'll just work towards those components. These are the things that lead to the result. And then you just do those things, would be a way of doing it. So you're no longer really looking at the result, like you've done that already in a sense. You've deconstructed the result that you want into its component parts that you now work on. I don't know if that makes sense or if you would need maybe a different example, but that's one way I would do it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's kind of like in one case going forward into openness, and then the other one is like you're being open, but you're reverse engineering from your intended goal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's I think that's a way that you could solve that problem. I don't know if that's necessarily a way that really involves intuition, openness so much, but it might be a way that works better with it. Because you don't want to get detached from the goal, because otherwise you don't really have a goal. It's not there anymore. But it's more like almost reframing what the goal is. I don't know if that necessarily even solves it. Well, it might solve it, because again, you can, if you're focusing on effort, then your goal is just do this thing X amount of times, and then you've won. Your goal is no longer an external determinant. So, because right now, if you have your homeschooling thing, you don't really get to decide if that's successful or not in some ways. Other people have to pick it up, and it's other people's choice ultimately. And so that's sort of what makes it unstable. That makes goals like that in general unstable. But if you shift it to something that you have absolute control over, or at least as close as possible, which is you following through on certain steps and whatnot, then that's a lot easier of a goal to keep, because you kind of can't lose at it, because you are the one in control of whether it happens or not. And since those things then feed into the external goal more or less, then that should, I would think, help keep you sort of more emotionally centered with it, rather than maybe being afraid, oh, I won't hit this or whatever. You've kind of taken care of that problem by putting it all in your own hands and changing your focus.
Mm-hmm.
Are you asking, Stephanie, how do you know if you're being open to what intuitively is your path, or how much is your goal setting part of the brain narrative?
I don't know if I really need to have a specific question. I was just kind of interested in exploring like how we can use this concept of detachment from results in different applications. And after discussing with Ryan a little further, it kind of reminded me of like my approach to teaching, which I don't like to call it teaching, is like instead of using standards, think about the qualities or characteristics of the child that you would like them to exhibit as an adult. And so then working in reverse engineering from there, instead of having like, okay, they're going to have these learning standards, Common Core state standards. I'd rather have the parent be able to choose, what they're working toward.
And in your example, what would an example of the reverse engineering look like?
Oh, I haven't gotten that far.
Okay. What comes to mind for me is to just bring in as much awareness as possible into our sense perceptions and current experience. And what comes to mind is if you have sense perception, SP, and on the other side, current experience, and you bring in this huge A in the middle, it spells out space. So you're bringing more space into the whole process. So
that sounds like the space between stimulus and response.
Yeah.
Is that work? Is that yeah, and that equals freedom.
Right.
Freedom. There it is.
Well, I've
Hey, Ryan.
definitely got more to think about, which was my goal. So thank you.
Hey, Ryan. Great presentation. It's super interesting. And I don't want to digress too much, but given what you're talking about the remote viewing and the remote healing, I wanted to ask if the mechanism is it similar, or is that completely another topic? That's just very curious. I'm very curious in regards to that area.
So for remote viewing, I would say there is enough of a separation between those that you can say they're separate, in the sense that one is more of a sensing, perceptual thing, and one is more active. With the healing, there's a whole, like, I could have done a whole other talk on just that, and I have, in fact, in practical parapsychology. So the mechanisms for that, the issue with psi in general is no one actually knows how it works. They know that it works. They know you can take it into a lab and demonstrate it over and over, but it doesn't appear to behave like other fields you see in physics. So it specifically, for example, does not obey the inverse square law. This is, in fact, specifically why one of the premier researchers on any of the remote healing type of stuff, who is Bill Bankston, his methodology and stuff is also all public and anyone can learn it. He specifically says, well, I don't think there's any energy involved because it doesn't decrease with distance, and it doesn't radiate in any way in a neutral radiation fashion like you see with electromagnetism. So basically no one knows exactly what the mechanism is, but they do have some idea of what isn't happening, or what at the very least seems to be happening or not happening. And one of those is that at least with his methods, or is what he studied, is it appears almost like you're stimulating the immune system to do whatever it's doing better. And so one of the ways they know this is that you can, for example, give cancer to a carrot, and carrots and other plants don't have organs, so cancer doesn't really affect them very much. But the idea behind this experiment was, well, okay, we're going to give cancer to a carrot. We'll get some people, some healers, or people who will sort of do a meditative focus on it or intention focus on it. And if the cancer goes away, well, then the energy or whatever this is what's affecting it. And plants don't have an immune system, so that would give you a really good way of knowing that. Well, it did nothing, basically. Cancer kind of continued to grow. It had no real effect on it. Whereas this does not happen when you do this with like mice. You can actually do this with cancer cells in a petri dish. Interestingly, this doesn't get rid of the cancer. It makes it grow like exponentially. Bill has actually said that one of the experiments he wants to do is take charged up super cancer and inject it into a mouse and see what happens. And his suspicion or hypothesis or whatever is that the cancer would then go away. But it does seem it seems almost like it's having an effect, like juicing up the immune system, because there's things it works really well on, and there's things it doesn't seem to work on well on at all. In his case, for example, malignant cancers specifically responded extremely well. Like fast-growing malignant cancers responded very well to sort of the healing method he researches. Whereas things like, I think it was Parkinson's, not Parkinson's, a better example would be type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes had very minimal effect. It certainly couldn't cure it. And so they were finding this pattern where it was really good at taking away things that you already had that you didn't want, but it really struggled with giving you things that you needed. So that was sort of like Alzheimer's. It might work well, so if you get rid of like plaque on the brain, but it wouldn't necessarily work well with I think it was Parkinson's, was the one where you're losing your myelin sheaths in some of your nerve fibers, and that kind of leads to some of the neurological issues that you see with that, and it couldn't really put those back. So in terms of the mechanisms, no, I'd say they're pretty different. Remote viewing certainly is going to have some crossover. You're still working with intent. You're still working with some of the same mental type of stuff. A lot of the psychological things are going to be very similar, but in terms of the physical mechanisms, it just, at least through what is known right now in terms of studies, it doesn't, as far as I'm aware, look like they're the same at all. I hope that answers your question and isn't way too verbose.
No, thank you so much. And thank you for elaborating. It's just super interesting stuff. So thanks again.
No problem. And I didn't even do, like, this isn't even the original presentation I was going to do, but it's certainly a better one. I was going to bring in stuff with like, physical mediumship and like, a whole bunch of crazy stuff that's also been studied. So we haven't even touched the really crazy stuff yet. The stuff that I think has insane, like what's called utility if it can be really understood and controlled well. So I'm really happy to be talking about this and still be blowing people away, or at least helping them.
Well, that's certainly kind of a little bit of a commercial for the things that you do on Tuesday evening, the parapsychology discussion.
Yep. Every Tuesday within Autonomy, I do not, this doesn't open to anyone outside of it. I do not post any of the recordings anywhere other than inside the Autonomy Forum. I do practical parapsychology every Tuesday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. That's when it starts. And I do my best to put together a similar-ish presentation to what you saw here on a particular topic. And the goal was that by the end of season 9, I could give people a general overview of what parapsychology as a field of science studies. There is no way I can go in depth on I can't go in depth for everything because I would have to spend the whole season on just one topic to go through just everything that's in, for example, remote viewing. If I wanted to really do it, I have to spend the whole season on just remote viewing, all the different protocols that have been developed, all the different things they've worked on and all that sort of stuff to give you a comprehensive view of just that. So it's designed to be a general overview, and thus people who are interested they have a starting point to go and look up more on their own. Hopefully that is enough of a plug. Probably is. In any case, there are people here who have not said anything yet, and maybe you don't want to say anything, but I do want to call on you specifically in case you do, in case you've been sitting there like, I'd like to say something, but I'm scared or whatever, whatever feeling or reason you might have to not say something you might want to say. And so I open the floor to you. And if you genuinely have nothing you want to say, I guess we'll go back to everyone else, but I'll give you a minute or so if you guys want to say anything, or at least start to let us know.
I just want to say thank you for the presentation. It was awesome. It was something that I've heard about but never really looked into it, and it was nice to see.
Hooray! You're very welcome.
Thank you.
I'm very glad that you liked it. Anyone else? At least from the crowd, from the few people who haven't said anything yet. And you can say no. You don't. Well, you can just say nothing. But I'll give you a little bit of time, just in case you're a little nervous or something, and then we'll continue on.
Thank you for the presentation. Just want to thank you.
Awesome.
It was great.
You're welcome. I'm glad you liked it. And I suppose with that, does anyone have, I'll just open up the floor to absolutely anyone. Anyone have anything left that they want to say before we close out? And then maybe have a bit of an after party if you want to have that.
I think Hassan had wanted to say something, or maybe he muted himself before he could say it. There he is.
So hello there. It's very interesting and very thought-provoking ideas. And I was familiar with Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove and his work on parapsychology, but I haven't looked into the term of practical parapsychology. I was entertaining this idea as an intellectual thing, not as practical thing. So you are bringing something important to the table, and I should go to your course about practical parapsychology.
Well, thank you very much. It's not really a course. I mean, technically I could have structured it like a course, but it's just like a meeting. And sometimes I bring in some of my own experiences, which are especially crazy, which is why I don't put them on here. But yeah, no, they're all recorded. I put them in Plug Your Work. So for the ones that I've recorded in the past, and the more recent ones I've started titling for like what I'm actually covering in them. So, there should be a decent itemized list of all that stuff, and hopefully they're helpful for people. That is the entire point. I may not be making any money at any of this stuff, certainly not yet, if ever, but nonetheless, I'm still going to put it out there and hopefully it'll help people.
Well, that's kind of the first step, is to educate people, and that's certainly one of the things that you're doing, and we're very grateful.
Hooray, thank you.
I'm enjoying the replays, so I feel like I'm just
Yes.
sort of catching up on stuff. Quilt upbeat,
Yes.
by the way, or upbeat quilt. So there.
Oh, yes, I forgot about that. That was the one. Yeah, that last one was 4 hours and or nearly 4 hours, and I almost regret going into the tangent I went into on the end, but that's okay.
I thought the tangent was really good because it's the personal experiences that I can't get somewhere else. So you're creating a container for everything is good, but then you're adding your genuinely strange and intriguing experiences is also kind of cool, and not
Well,
something that can be found elsewhere readily. So yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. I do actually, I really do appreciate that you are actually the one person, at least so far, who's finding those code words and putting them in there, because it's like, yes, it's working. So I'm glad that I was doing that, because it does help. But yeah, no, I'm glad.
It's funny because you say you don't want to put them at the end, and in the last one you're like, well, I hate doing this, I hate putting it in at the end, but here goes, and then you give the words, and then you talk for like another 2 hours. So I thought, well,
Yeah,
that was a good strategy.
yeah, pretty much. But with that, I do think I should share my screen one last time. And play us out. Sorry, I'm doing this all on my own, so I'm not going to be super smooth with it. I don't think I did too bad, given that I have like no peripheral vision and all that sort of stuff.
Before you press play, I want to say you're just kind of embodying that aspect we talked about earlier of just doing what you're going to do with excellent without being attached to the result, and then you get a good result. So well done.
Yeah, thank you very much. I came into this with this idea like I'm just going to do it and things will happen and it'll be whatever. That's my normal thing. And then it got all discombobulated because I was doing that. And then it was like, oh, by the way, you maybe can't do the presentation you were going to do. It would probably be like the worst thing. And so I was like, oh my God. But nonetheless, I did it. I think given the circumstances, given this presentation is like a few hours old in many ways, like even the planning and everything, and then I had to modify it again. I think I did pretty good. So thank you all for being here. We will definitely have to see you again for either if you come to a practical parapsychology or if you come to another Do It Live. See you then, and I'm going to play us out. So let's do that. All righty. And if you want to stick around for an after show, we can do that. I guess I can stop the recording and start another one. I don't know if that's the standard practice.
I think you just leave the recording going.
Yeah, that's honestly, that's how I would personally do it. If I were to edit stuff, it's easier. Anyways, so yeah, that was my presentation.
Well done.
People enjoyed it.
You did a great job, Ryan.
Yeah, great job.
Well done.
I think it's cool you brought this topic to a wider audience because like I haven't been able to make it on Tuesdays, but man, I love this topic. I remember back in season 6 when we first started, you and I were just chatting one day, but I think it might've been before I was on Do It Live. And like you were just keeping me company as I set up my little fake studio area and told me all about it. I was like cleaning the bathroom and doing all kinds of stuff. And I think we talked for like an hour, and it's just so fascinating. That was my first taste of any of this. So I'm really glad that you're able to bring it to the stage again here where I could access it.
Well, I'm glad because, like I said, I'm very used. Well, I'm more used now almost to people having a positive reaction, but in the past, it definitely wasn't really the case. So it's still weird to me that like people are as supportive as they are. But I'm glad that I was able to, I guess, stimulate you back then to think about this stuff. I don't know if you were thinking about it at the time at all, or if this was like literally your first, if I was like literally your first intro to it, because I would argue I'm not the best intro to it, especially if I'm talking about some of the stuff that happened to me. But I'm glad that you enjoy it and that it's helped you.
Well, I feel like your presentation skills are growing tremendously, Ryan. Like you have progressed so much. It's
Thank you very
impressive.
much. Yeah, it makes it hard to argue for me to argue for not doing a full-time podcast of this, because I like it'd be easy enough when you get right down to it to schedule interviews with researchers and all that sort of stuff. And if I were to do that, I would be doing it on the basis of I don't just want to talk about the field. I want to talk about practical applications. Like, how do you take this stuff and make it useful? Obviously, remote viewing is the easiest thing. Actually, speaking of that, I can't really say at this point that I know Bro Perkins. He was the guy who was interviewing Lloyd Auerbach about James Randi. But I've talked with him back and forth. He actually wanted to interview me at one point. I declined on the basis at the time of him. He basically wanted to make me a regular guest, but he wanted to make me like an expert, or portray me that way. And I was going to be like, no, like that's not happening. He didn't mean anything like bad by it. I just was really uncomfortable, especially at that point. But he had actually done an interview with a researcher named Exel Cardinia at one point, who's a guy, I don't know if he's still there, but he was at the time, like had some major chair at Lund University in Sweden. He had put together this whole other like study or series of studies or whatever that was, let's look at all of the data for psi and see if it's a thing. And he concluded, yeah, it's a thing. So he was doing an interview on that. And so I had gotten Bro to ask him, like, what can we use this for practically and stuff. So I was already back then trying to do that. I think it's so far past the point of like, is it real or not and stuff like that, that like, it's almost ridiculous. It should be, people, in my opinion, it's almost like it needs an engineering overhaul at this point of like, like, how do we take this and use it? Because it's very clearly usable. It just needs to be refined. So yeah, that's my thing, I guess.
So I have a question to Jane about the cat being out of the bag. Do you know where that comes from? And I feel a little latitude to ask that because this is the after party. But do you know where that comes from, Jane, or anybody? The cat is out of the bag.
I have no idea.
All right.
I'm thinking that like the Salem witches, or not necessarily the Salem witches, but the witches that used to have the black cats and all right, never mind.
That may be, but the way I know about it is the bosun on the big ships had a cat nine tails, and if you broke the rules on the ship, he would take the cat nine tails out of the bag. And then you would get lashed up, so these big bosuns or the chief mate would, you don't want the cat out of the bag. And so that's where that derivation.
What is that? Cat nine tailed?
Yeah.
It's like
it's a whip. And they would, strap these, if you had too many rations of rum or whatever, and they lash you up on some, plank or something, and then the bosun or the chief mate would take the cat nine tails. It was had these tails coming off, and they would whip you, and it was like, you don't want the cat out of the bag. And so
what is that word though that you're saying? Cat nine?
Cat of nine tails.
Cat of nine tails. Cat of nine tails.
Okay, cool.
Anyway, never mind. When you said that, Jay.
Don't Google it because you'll start getting internet results that are different from what. But it's a whip with like 9 ends on it, so it like flays the skin.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay, let's change the subject. Ryan, how are you feeling now compared to right before the podcast?
I'm slightly better. I recovered pretty quickly. I was just sort of slightly annoyed at the beginning. It's like I did this thing on the pretense that, you know, I could do it. I even put a post in the forum saying, hey, I'm going to do this thing this way unless someone tells me no, and then nobody did. And then it's like last minute, I'm essentially told, yeah, you probably shouldn't do that. And so I had to adapt immediately. Admittedly, if I had known beforehand about these sort of, would seem almost like new rules that I didn't see before, because I got inspired to do this because I think it was Daryl Becker or whoever it was who did the thing on like naturopathy and all that sort of stuff. And I was like, well, that means I could do my stuff in the same vein. You know, and I was willing to do that. If I had known that maybe wasn't so much the case, I might not have even bothered signing up. But I'm here and I did it. I think I did reasonably okay. So I feel okay. And if other people don't think I did okay, which doesn't seem to be the case, I think I still feel okay because I still did it. But, you know, yeah, I guess the short version is I feel slightly better.
I'm glad you did it. Like after you were done, it looked like your face was just like happy and free and yeah. So, and you know, I'm happy because I enjoyed it.
Right.
Yeah, that's good feedback for, you know, like Joshua and I made that Do It Live course, little mini course, and maybe we just need to put more information in there that this should be focused on autonomy. And then going forward, then people will know.
Yeah, I mean, I did the course before. When I got access to it this time, all I was using that for was to get the get the username and password for the guest autonomy account, which then, you know, I couldn't use anyways. So I didn't exactly go through it a second time.
Yeah, you went through the Do It Live course a while back. And you know what? I do think it has changed. I know it's changed. Ever since we moved to the forum, we had to change it, but I haven't seen the new product. So, but either way, yeah. We'll just have to go through and make sure that people understand that the purpose of it, I guess.
Well, really, what I mean is like the purpose, it's probably in there. I mean, the course is, at least the videos I did watch so I could get to the next videos were identical to what I saw before. It didn't appear to have been changed. It still even has Joshua mentioning like Discord and everything. So it's certainly not been updated for the forum. So if it has been updated, if later videos have been updated or stuff, then, you know, I didn't see that. But, you know, I assume that much like when I saw it the first time, it does mention, hey, this, you know, it's technically before that. And the only reason I didn't follow that to the letter, certainly, is because of, you know, seeing other people do presentations that didn't seem to have anything to do with that. So I was like, oh, it means it's only there if you don't have a topic of your own.
It just means Daryl didn't bother to go through any rules or didn't check out the course. You know what I'm saying? Like he just showed up and did whatever he did. And then you took. Well,
I don't even know if Daryl was the right. I don't even know if it's Daryl. I'm using that name because that's
no.
The
I
one
remember you were in Q&A. You said toward the end that maybe you'd even host in a future week because you saw what Daryl did. So I was like, all right, we'll see how that goes. You did a good job of presenting your passion, and I think you did a good job of laying it out so that people were interested and curious and want to look into it more. And they didn't see anything that means walk away, run away from this topic. You know. So I think you did a good job representing a very obtuse topic that a lot of people don't know anything substantial about. But when you bring the points that the military has spent a lot of money, and people around the world have spent a lot of money on these types of research over the years, and then they mix that research with like psychedelics and stuff like that, and now they're going to mix it with like Neuralinks and stuff soon. So once everyone's jacked in, how easy is it for people to remote view what you got going on? Like they're building a super highway to your brain.
I wonder if that would actually enhance it at all, to be honest. It might, it might not. I decided to take out the clip I had of, you know, because this was YouTube, and even though the clip is already on YouTube, of, you know, it's like, I cut it off where it said, oh yeah, and they took Pat Price and, you know, the CIA wanted him. And, you know, I removed that clip because the end of the clip is the CIA essentially put Pat Price to act as a fake farmer, and a month later he was dead under mysterious circumstances. So I'm like, you know, I'll cut that part out. You know, if we're going to do this for YouTube and all this stuff, even though that's already a YouTube clip, you know, yeah, so I guess the moral of the story is don't work for the CIA, or if you do, don't be too good at your job. So
Yeah, Frank Olson learned that.
yeah. But yeah, they seem to not like that Pat Price could read classified information. So without having to open it. That's the theory anyways. But yeah. Yeah, no, I think I did okay. And that was sort of the intent, is give people an overview. If they want to learn more, they can, they know where to look. I can provide all of the citations, like I provide all the video links to put under like the description of the video, which I'd recommend because I want to cite everything. You know, which gives people an easy way of looking into this stuff, at least as an initial thing. Because yeah, like you can't, as Joe McMonagle says, and I've learned this a long time as well, it's like, don't even bother with the people who are just the scoffers who just, nothing will convince them. It's just, there's no point. Just put the information out.
Scoffers.
Was that?
I like that. Don't bother with the scoffers.
It's the same thing in business, right? The people who complain about your price aren't your customers because they're not buying. The people who do buy and don't complain about your price are your customers. Focus on them. Yeah.
It's been a little bit different with any of the parapsychology stuff because it's legitimately affected people's careers. Where if you especially in academia, this doesn't seem to be as much of the case these days, but it certainly was the case where it's like you could literally like lose your tenure and stuff if you even expressed interest in any of this stuff, let alone any positive support. There's a whole in my practical parapsychology thing, I didn't really so much bring this in as a clip, but there's a lady named Angela Ford who she goes into a whole bunch of the managerial issues they had. Incidentally, one of the you would know that, well, you'd know the name anyways. General Stubblebine was the guy who was involved with a lot of this stuff, and I know that name comes up every once in a while in Grand Theft World. And so she was talking about how the people they would have in their managerial positions were people who were like, a year from retirement. So they weren't really getting the best people. And one of the reasons they were doing that is because anyone who touched these topics, it was like career suicide. So they would put people into the program who were, already on their way out as a way of sort of mitigating that. And so it was a lot more than just, I'm just not going to talk to, like, I'll just not deal with the people who aren't my customers, because they would come to you. They would come to you and ruin your whole reputation and everything. Like the James Randi stuff, for example, was just one aspect of that. There's a whole lot of that. So it was a little bit, it's like, yes, you don't want to deal with them, but because they had such a tendency to come deal with you, there's sort of like a balance that you have to reach with that. It's thankfully not quite so bad these days. And that's partially because people, like, there's so much evidence for this stuff now that a lot of people are pushing back on these pseudo skeptics and the scoffers and stuff, and pointing out that they're just being irrational. And that's a really good thing to see. And so this is really, I think, the sort of the start of the curve of, if you really want to actually do something with business with this, like, this is the time probably to be doing it when, because there's already some businesses for it that you can either contract yourself, like I mentioned there, Problem Solutions Innovations, and I know there's other ones, but you can start your own if you're able to get people together who you can show are reasonably skilled and whatnot, and you could probably really dominate with that stuff, or just use it yourself.
Maybe someone can open up a remote viewing to find my phone for me. I would pay money for that, man. Every time I lose my phone, please, can I call you?
Not me. I don't do it. I probably should do it, but I do not.
It's Find My Phone without the government spies attached to it. Somebody should start that up, man.
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say that, because that reminds me of like TaskRabbit or something like that. I don't know if anyone knows what TaskRabbit is.
Isn't that where it helps you decide which tabs to close or something?
No, TaskRabbit. TaskRabbit is like, come over and put this IKEA furniture together for me. It's like these really small, like handyman type tasks. It's like, just do this random little thing for me. Go, set up a blender or something. Like it's small little things like that. But it's a really cool idea, because it's not for professionals. You're not hiring like a professional to do something. You're just hiring someone to do something that is really small, like that.
At your house.
Yeah. So you can look it up. It's called, I think it's, I don't know if it's taskrabbit.com.
That's great
but
because I was just weeding earlier and like, this is not the highest and best use of my time.
yeah, but your whole thing of like finding your phone, that just reminds me of like a TaskRabbit type of thing, just more specialized. But you know, you'd have, again, for that, you'd have to have someone who's really like Joe says, it's like this is a human performance thing, and for like anything in human performance, no one does it 100% of the time. It just doesn't happen. Doesn't matter if it's athletics or whatever. The analogy they often like to use is, you know, Babe Ruth was the best baseball player of all time, and he struck out like a third of the time or 2/3 of the time or something. And yet he's considered the best. So nobody expects him to be perfect. So why would you expect these people to be perfect when you're dealing with a human performance test? So that would be the more realistic thing. But yeah, I actually do wonder about the Neuralink thing, because I know Jeffrey Martin, who's, you know, his community is what I'm plugged into, who does all the work on fundamental well-being. He's very invested in trying to figure out like electronic stimulation stuff to help people get into deeper meditative states easier and whatnot. He's very invested in that, like monetarily and otherwise. And he's done a lot of research on that. And so I'll definitely see, because there's a huge amount of overlap with all of that. Like he knows Russell Targ, and like he knows a lot of these people. So I have him as sort of a connection. He was there apparently when Russell, I think it was Russell Targ, was doing some of the psychokinetic experiments they also had done at SRI. If I remember correctly. That would have been, yeah, I'm trying to remember. Anyways, point is like he would be someone I'd be looking to figure out, like, hey, so can you do electronic stimulation that actually helps people with psychic functioning? Because that would be interesting to know if that's even a thing. It wouldn't surprise me if it is, but it also wouldn't surprise me if it isn't, if it'd be more disruptive. But yeah.
Well, what was interesting in one of the videos that you showed was when they asked the remote viewer to target the cabin, but then he went to the object that had the brighter light. And that actually, you know, that might be a clue for all of us, is that you want something, have good intention and put your energy into it. It becomes a beacon for you to attract the things that you want to happen in your life.
Yeah. No, that seems to, there's a whole other realm of research on that for what's it called, in terms of like manifesting results and stuff. And I did a whole practical parapsychology on that. That's actually the same one, if I remember correctly, as the healing one, because they're related. But that does generally seem to be a thing. But yeah, I don't know what else. I had a whole other thing I was going to say on that, but anyways, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, you know, you're raising the awareness within autonomy. That's certainly, you know, like creating, like we're putting our antenna up for those kind of people to some degree. So I feel like this is it's a really powerful possibility, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, I take the stance that, especially if you talk about like the freedom community type of stuff, everyone here, you know, everyone here, basically everyone in it is in many ways playing at a disadvantage, and therefore they need every advantage they can get. And these are things that provide actual advantages. And therefore people should probably know about them, especially since they don't require extra technology or anything like that. They basically just require time and effort to develop. And so that's one of the reasons why I do this. It's like, you should really, like, these are things people should look into. And I know that this has been brought up at some like greater aspects of this have been brought up at like Greater Reset conferences and whatnot, in little bits and pieces. But it's not typically done in a way that's like, yeah, here's the researchers themselves talking about. I don't bring in the documents on it because my eyes are so bad that reading that is painful. So I just bring in the podcast episodes and stuff, and it's usually more entertaining for people anyways to just sit and listen or watch. But yeah, it's like, you would be completely mind blown of what's actually been studied and what they've actually found. You like, usually when someone just, thank you, Ryan, have to go, excellent work. You are welcome, Jane. I am glad that you liked it. Yeah, it's pretty insane. Like the physical mediumship stuff, when you realize that like Charles Richet was one of the people who was like doing research on, I think it was Frank Klusky, and it's like, here's the pictures of the plaster molds they got of like these, materialized hands dipping into wax and stuff. And it's like, there they are. And it's like, stuff like that. And they're getting like that sort of stuff out of it. And it's like, yeah, this stuff happens. But yeah. Obviously I can go on and on about it forever.
Well, I feel very fulfilled, and I thank you all so much. Ryan, well done. Congratulations. And I also have to shove off at this time. So I just want to let you know that how complete I feel, and I thank you so much.
Hooray, I'm glad everyone liked it. That's actually kind of surprising. Or at least I'm glad you liked it. I can't speak for everyone. Maybe there's someone in here who's just like, I hated it. I sat in here anyways, for all I know.
I loved it. Thank you for doing it.
Just for the record, I loved it too.
Hooray.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm just making dinner for the kids.
Yeah, I think that pretty much wraps it up. I think it was a hit, Ryan. So well done. I'm going to take
Hooray.
off myself.
All righty. And with
Take
that,
care, everybody.
I do think I should end it, unless people have other things they want to talk about or specific things they want to ask or anything like that. Like, I'll stick around. But otherwise, I think we could end it.
I have one question, but it's not relevant necessarily to this presentation. So maybe
That's fine. This is the after party.
Okay. So I was listening to when you were talking about Gold training you. Why was she training you? Like what?
Why was she doing it?
Yes. Like, is there?
So, like most things with me, that's a very long story. The short version is it was a favor to her younger sister. That was essentially why she was doing it. Why it was a favor to her younger sister is also not as much longer story. But how much should I go into for this? Basically, let's go with the short version. So presumably this is how the memories go, and presumably how all the other experiences have gone so far anyways. So memories go that I at one point was living not so much with them, but sort of in their area as essentially part of a cultural exchange thing, because they didn't like, there's another culture they didn't like, and they had a lot of propaganda against them that, oh my God, these are horrible warmongering people or something. It was basically trying to justify what would eventually become essentially genocide against them. That's what was attempting to happen. So as part of this, I essentially supposedly got selected as like, we're going to let this go. We're going to perform one of our most sacred rituals for you guys, and we're going to let this guy live with you, and you can see that we're not what they say we are. So I got sort of placed with the family, grew up with them and all that sort of stuff. And Gold's younger sister and I, basically started getting into a relationship. And I eventually, with one of the people I was living with, who was sort of a little bit influential in the, like they were pretty influential in that society, discovered that they were doing something that amounted to high treason. And to basically get rid of me, they did a thing that was essentially to attempt to depersonalize the soul, because they couldn't kill it. And wrapped my best friend up in that as well as an accomplice. So the intent, as I found it much later, was that this would happen. I'd eventually, die. I'd get lost in the incarnation cycle, and no one would never be able to find me again. This didn't happen, as it turned out. So during that time, with me sort of living somewhere else at that point and not knowing anything about any of the past, though apparently, so I've been told, exhibiting a bunch of behavioral things. Yellow, who is Gold's younger sister, was basically trying to figure out where I was. And so she found me and was like, hey, I think that's him. And there was a whole bunch of stuff happening where I was at that time, which is, again, a whole other story. And so she had apparently requested that Gold come and like help me out and train me. which would have been a high treason thing on her side. So she had a whole bunch of safeguards she put up and stuff. But that's essentially, yeah, this sounds insane, but like this is apparently how it went. According to all that stuff. And like I said, I don't say this stuff really lightly or anything, because like I have done as much digging and as much of my own experiments and everything to find out, hey, is any of this even remotely true? Is there any possibility to it? And I just keep coming out with, yeah, like everything keeps adding up whenever I go and test any of the physics and test any, any of the claims that I can find. And especially now that I found the field of parapsychology, it just like, I don't get evidence that goes against it. And I've looked, like there's things that would have falsified all this, and I just don't have them. The only issue is it doesn't necessarily prove the narrative per se. Nonetheless, this is the claim that is the claim of the memories. And I do try to push those away from myself a little bit, because I don't want to be like, oh, it feels real, therefore it's real, because that doesn't mean anything. But that is the claim. The claim is that is sort of supposedly how it goes, is that it was a favor to her sister. And I was already sort of supposed to be getting training and stuff that before anyways, but that was sort of the way it went. Like I said, all of this can be expanded out to a much longer story with all the extra context, but that's kind of the short version for now.
Okay, thank you. I guess I was wondering, like some of it, I wasn't sure if there was some sort of organized resistance or something, because we were talking about the classroom and things she was teaching you.
Oh, that has nothing to do with any of that. That has nothing to do with that. That has nothing to do with yeah, that I'd have to go into a whole other explanation for.
All right.
But yeah, that has nothing to do with that specific story.
Okay.
And so when I say favor to her sister-in-law stuff, this is all stuff that, according to the memories, is like long in the past. Like this has nothing to do with anything current. That's all way in the past and dealt with. But like if you're asking like, the simpler answer, if you're asking like this life, it's because that's what we were already doing. Like it's, I don't know. I don't know if that explains anything.
It's a carryover in essence.
Yeah. I mean, she has made the argument that that basically she doesn't even want me to see her as a sort of teacher or anything anymore, that I should be doing that myself. And I agree, maybe sort of kind of, as much as I still do have like respect for her and whatnot, but it's kind of hard to teach people stuff when you can't do it yourself. So that's kind of why I focus on, the stuff that I'm focusing on, rather than building a traditional business, because that would be, in my opinion, like not only would that be a waste of my time, that would go against any problem I'm trying to solve with this stuff, because it would feed more into the problems than solve them. So that's why I don't typically do that, and it'll be very unfortunate if I'm forced to do that just to survive. But we'll see.
Okay, thank you. I have more questions, but that's enough for today.
No problem. I'm willing to answer pretty well anything. I will at least do my best.
Okay, I've got enough going around in my brain right now, so thank you.
No problem. Anyone else, or does everyone feel like maybe we should quit? Well, not quit, but like end this.
I'm gonna pop off and finally clean the kitchen, but thank you again, Ryan. It's been nice talking to you today. See you later.
All right. Bye-bye. And with that, I do think I will end this for everyone. So thank you all for coming. Glad you all liked it. Hopefully I can continue to do some pretty decent stuff in the future. And with that, I will see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.